Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we are going to have a look at procedural blood splatter effects for your anime or 2D inspired animation projects. I recently helped with environment and effects for this Gods of War fan animation by Croasan. You can check out more of his fan animations on his Twitter channel, and you should definitely check them out in the description below. And this tutorial will show you how to create blood splatters just like you see here. If you're just interested in using the blood splatter, you can also just download the asset from my Gumroad page for free. So without further ado, let's go. All right, let's delete everything in the scene. Let's add a UV sphere. We're gonna squash it down. And then we're going to go into our shader editor, add a new material. We're gonna set it to an emission shader. Let's add a Voronoi texture. And we're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And let's plug in the UV. Now let's play around with the scale. We're going to set this to something like 10. And the Y scale we're going to set to 3. As you can see, this can give you different shapes and different effects for your blood splatter. But we are going to go for 3 for now. So next up, we're going to add a linear gradient. So select a gradient texture. I'm going to leave it to linear. And we're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node again. And we're going to mix this in with our Voronoi texture. So let's add a mix RGB node. Let's plug it in. And we're going to set the texture coordinate to UV. And now we're going to add 2 color ramps. And this is going to act like a mask. So I'm going to show you. We can add a color ramp in between the linear and the color RGB. And we're going to add a color ramp after the mix RGB. I'm going to set this one to a constant. And we're going to play around with our color ramp and set it to something like this, where you have 2 black bars and your white color is going to decide where your splatter is going to go. So this is going to be like a mask. And then of course the mix node decides how much this mask will interact with the Voronoi texture. And that's going to be the basis of our blood splatter. If you want a smaller blood splatter, this is the place to edit it. If you want a bigger one, you just play around with these settings. I'm going to leave it to these settings for now. So next up, we're going to add a mask to fade the blood towards the edges. And so we're going to copy paste this linear. We're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we're going to also plug it in using a mix RGB. We're going to set it to UV. And we're going to add a rotation of 90 degrees. And then we're going to set our X location to something around 1.4. Let's try this out. And let's add a color ramp too. Let's set this mix RGB node to multiply. And then we're going to switch these two around. and this will fade our blood towards the edges. Let's see how that looks. If we move our Y for the Voronoi, we can already see what that's going to look like. Now it looks more like a flamethrower maybe than a blood splatter, but that's because we're going to add another Voronoi that's going to make these patterns into smaller bubbles that are going to fade. So that's what we're going to do next. Let's add another Voronoi texture. And we're going to set this one to 35. We're also going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, plug it into the UV, and we're going to scale X to 10. We can plug it into our material output to see what that looks like. And that's going to provide us with these little splatters. So let's plug this into a mix RGB node behind our first Voronoi texture. Let's plug it in. And of course, we only want this to fade towards the edge. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our linear that we used before, and we're going to plug that into this mix value. So let's make some room. Going to plug it in, and then we're going to add a color ramp to control it. And as you can see, we can make sure it fades only after a certain area. Set it to this setting for now. And we actually want to inverse this because we want it to look like little drops of blood. So let's go here and add an invert after our second Voronoi texture. So next up, we're going to want to add some drivers to these mapping nodes, and those will move the blood splatter automatically for us. So to do that, go into your Y and you go hash frame divided by 10. And this division is going to set the speed of the animation. So let's test that. It's looking good. And then we're going to want to do the same for our second Voronoi texture. So let's set it to frame divided by 10. There you go. And so this is just spilling blood. Let's maybe set our color to red just to get an idea more of the final look. And that's looking good. I think next up it would be a good idea to make a mask to have some sort of fade in and fade out for the blood so that we can animate it later on. Maybe first let me turn this into a transparent shader. So let's add a mix shader node. Let's add a transparent BSDF, plug it in, and we're going to plug this color ramp into the alpha. Set this to black and this one to white. There you go. To make this work, you have to go into the material properties and set it to alpha clip. We're also going to set shadow mode to alpha clip, and then our emission we're going to set to a red color. We're going to use this bright red just for visibility right now, and I'm going to set my color management to standard as well, and this is going to make it pop like hell. Alright, That's looking good. So now we're going to add another linear gradient. Going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, plug it into a mix RGB, and we're going to add a color ramp. Let's rotate it 90 degrees, and this time we're going to do it on the Y value. Let's maybe plug it into our material output so that we can see what's going on. And let's set this color ramp to first black edge, white cutoff, another white cutoff, and then we're going to end with black again. And so what this is going to do is that when we move our X location, this will make a moving mask that will be able to control the blood, or at least the transparency of the blood. So let's set this to multiply. We're gonna plug our mix shader back into the material output so we can see the final result. Let's set it to a max value and let's try this out. So this should act as a mask. I think the mask is a bit too harsh, so we can play around with the values a bit. I'm gonna leave it right here. And let's make a small animation with this. So let's add a timeline. Gonna set it to 1. This is going to be our first keyframe. And I'm going to set my X to where no blood is visible. Let's press the I key, and this is going to create a keyframe. So if we click on our mapping node and on our object, here you can see the keyframe. Next up, let's set it to something like 20, and let's move the slider to where it disappears again, something like 0, and let's see how it behaves in between. So here our blood appears, and then it should disappear. And we can move these keyframes around and try some different timings. You can time it however you like. This is, of course, going to depend on your scene and what kind of blood splatter you want. So this last fade is going to be impacted by where we set this color ramp value, so I'm gonna tweak it a little bit. Alright, I'm going to set my end frame to 30, and then I can loop it just to see what's going on. It's maybe a bit blobby, so to able to control this, this is because we have our mask interfering with our Voronoi texture, and this mix node will control a bit of the blobbiness. Of course, if we mix it too much, then we get some unwanted splashes. So something we can do is actually add a second mask. So let's add a color ramp and another mix RGB node, and we're going to add it behind our first mask. And this one we're going to set to a constant. and set it to multiply. Let's maximize this multiply, and now we can have a hard cutoff value. Basically, it's a second mask that gets rid of all of these extra splashes that happen when you mix these two together. So now we can really bring this down and get maybe some of the shapes we want, and then maybe these were a bit unwanted, so we can have an extra mask. Alright, that's looking good. Let me bring that back a bit. Just play around with it. And then of course you can also play around with the final color ramp, which is going to decide the thickness of the blood as well. So if you want to get rid of some of the blobbiness, that's of course also a factor to play with. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so next up what I want to do is add another Voronoi texture. And this time what we're going to do is make even smaller droplets, and they are going to turn our blood into even smaller droplets at the end of our animation, and we're going to keyframe that in. So let's add a mix RGB node. Let's take our Voronoi and invert, Shift D, duplicate them, and we're going to plug them in. Going to plug them into the same mapping and texture coordinate node as our previous one, and we're going to set this to 50. And so this slider is going to let us turn the entire blood splatter into smaller particles. So let's keyframe that in. So right about here I want it to start, so let's set it to 0 and press I to set a keyframe. And then at frame 23, I'm going to set it to something like 0.35. Press I to set a keyframe. And now we can move these keyframes to play with the speed. So here it isn't interacting at all, and here it's going to turn everything into smaller droplets right before it ends. So and there we go. You can always play around with these values. If you want the droplets to be larger, you can set it again to something different. I think this is looking good. Maybe I want the blood splatter to last a bit longer, and so you can always go back to your keyframes, go to this mapping, and move it around. So I think I like this, and that's a good blood splatter. If you want a larger blood splatter, you can play around with these masks, and because this is all based on UVs and geometry, you can go into edit mode, and we're gonna click on proportional editing. Click on one of these vertices. And if you scaled them, you can get some distortions, or if you want the blood to drop, you can add a curve. Let's use page down. So you can get the blood splatter to curve a bit. So maybe it's subject to gravity. Alright, but let's set it back. And that's basically it. That's our blood splatter. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe. And you can download all of the assets on my Gumroad page, which is in the description below. And see you guys next time.